Some of the most notable progress seen across the Final Fantasy franchise has been related to the expansion and increasing intricacies of battle mechanics. Through this medium, we've seen turn-based systems become far more nuanced with each new installment, as embellishments such as the ATB system, summons, and limit breaks have enhanced the experience. Each of these mechanics has come with a different objective, but some of them have been tasked with increasing single-move damage output. And as time has passed and expectations have changed, developers have become more ambitious as they've sought to push damage higher to compensate for bosses having ever-increasing pools of HP. This has opened the door for players to start unleashing extraordinary damage numbers in single actions, as certain abilities, equipment combinations, and character builds have become far more malleable. And this has then added a unique twist to how players have been able to approach battles and character customization. And this is exactly what we're going to be talking about in this video, as we run through some of the most mind-blowing attacks from across the franchise. Now, while we have discussed some of these abilities in the past, for this video, we're turning things over to you, the viewers. And as a special note, we won't be discussing abilities that inflict instant death, as this would technically be considered an affliction of the death status effect. Instead, we're going to be focusing on single attacks and strategic moves capable of dealing huge amounts of damage within their respective gameplay systems. So strap yourselves in, as we're going to kick things off with Trigger Happy from Final Fantasy X-2. The Dress Sphere system in Final Fantasy X-2 represented an intriguing evolution of the traditional job system, and it worked hand in hand with the dynamic evolution of the ATB system, which allowed for much more fluidity within the combat scene. Just like traditional job systems, each Dress Sphere was given a specific command ability, and this helped to provide a high degree of distinction. But while many Dress Spheres boasted some kind of beneficial utility, in terms of sheer power, one stood out in particular, the Gunner and its Trigger Happy command. When used, this special command ability allowed players to shoot a target as many times as they could input the action during the specified time window. In the most extreme instances, this meant a maximum of 99 shots was possible, but a more realistic number, given the brief time frame allotted to the move, was around 18 to 25 shots. At first glance, this meant Trigger Happy didn't necessarily seem all that powerful, as its attack power was generally the same as that of a normal attack. However, in the original PlayStation 2 versions of Final Fantasy X-2, some careful arrangement could see it become one of the most powerful actions in the entire game, and this was because of the catnip accessory. In that original version of the game, equipping the catnip accessory allowed the associated character's attacks to deal 9,999 damage and all HP restoration actions to heal for 9,999 HP, but only if they had the HP critical status. Thus, when using the original catnip with the Trigger Happy command ability, this meant players would be able to inflict multiple hits of 9,999 damage. Even if a player only managed to make 10 shots, they would deal almost 100,000 points of damage. That's what made this particular command quite special though, as it was quite possible to achieve way more than 10 shots. Leveling the Trigger Happy command to level 3, for example, increased the shooting time to 2.6 seconds. A delay could also be enacted between each shot by casting haste. And if it's not considered cheating, then using a turbo controller could facilitate even more shots being fired before the timer ended. In light of these different means of achieving more shots within a single use of Trigger Happy, players could find themselves dishing out countless hits, all with maximum damage, and it meant the ability had the potential to deal hundreds of thousands of points of damage. Unfortunately, with the release of the game's international version and the HD remasters, the catnip accessory ended up being reworked. While retaining most elements of its original function, catnip was revised to render the wearer perpetually inflicted with the berserk and slow statuses, and this prevented the player from being able to execute the Trigger Happy command without issues. But in hindsight, this was perhaps done to limit the nigh game-breaking capabilities of the move in its original form. As the franchise began to feature more customization, players started to be able to achieve astonishing damage outputs by strategically manipulating their character builds. Such a scenario was exemplified in Final Fantasy VI, where Locke Cole stood out due to his ability to deal intense damage within a specific setup. This was largely because he could equip not one, but two weapons that ignored defense, the Valiant Knife and the Ultima Weapon. To maximize the build, players would need to equip Locke with the Master Scroll and the Genji Glove. The Master Scroll allowed the user to attack 4 times, and although each hit dealt half the damage of a normal attack, it effectively doubled the total damage output. When paired with the Genji Glove, which enabled dual wielding and allowed 2 actions per turn, this combination became remarkable. The Master Scroll and Genji Glove together therefore enabled Locke to deliver 8 hits in 1 turn. In terms of the damage values that could be achieved this way, there were some other factors that weighed in on this. While Ultima Weapon dealt more damage when the user's HP was high, Valiant Knife was the antithesis, dealing more damage when the user's HP was low. However, the latter still boasted enough power to work in this scenario. What's more, the Valiant Knife ignored the Master Scroll's damage-limiting penalties. Thus, when equipped on Locke, along with Ultima Weapon, and with Locke having enough HP, players saw him dealing a relatively consistent 40,000 damage per turn. Now, achieving this build was no easy task, as there were quite a few steps involved with acquiring all of the equipment required, but in light of the serious payoff, it was a worthy time investment. Limit breaks are some of the most blatant methods for dealing hefty damage. But while the name of these actions and conditions for using them have been subject to different changes over the course of the franchise, their main function has remained consistent, in that they were meant to help players gain an advantage in combat, especially when the chips were down. In Final Fantasy XII, limit breaks manifested as quickenings, but they had a rather unique makeup compared to other entries in the franchise. Quickenings were powerful attacks that functioned on a scale much higher than that of other abilities in the game, as they dealt non-elemental damage and very notably had the potential to break through the damage ceiling. Just like summons, they were ascribed a level from 1 to 3, with their power increasing as they leveled up. One of the major distinctions between quickenings and past limit break mechanics, though, was how they were executed, as they played out much like an interactive movie. They required the player to make real-time inputs to keep the attacks coming in a chain, and the required inputs came via a small menu which relayed both the time and a list of quickenings to follow up with the current scenario. The list of ready quickenings would, however, be left up to random number generation, but the player could refresh them to attempt to try and select a quickening of their choice, albeit racing against the clock to do so before the chain concluded. In the original Final Fantasy XII, quickenings relied on copious amounts of MP for casting. However, this was changed in the Zodiac version of the game. Instead of using MP, they relied on mist charges, which acted as a secondary gauge to facilitate them. But perhaps the real strength of quickenings came from completing chains and obtaining different concurrences. These were special bonus attacks. However, in order to trigger a specific concurrence, namely the more powerful entries like Whiteout and Black Hole, players had to chain a certain pattern of leveled quickenings, and with much of the selection being left to random numbers, this was no simple task. But even if players couldn't attain the strongest concurrences, chaining quickenings could still yield impressive damage numbers. Even a decent chain of quickenings could very well deal up to 30,000 points of damage, with the strongest concurrence, Black Hole, having the potential to deal out 60,000 points of damage, which was the hard damage cap of the game. As such, the use of quickenings was an effective way of finishing off bosses or elite marks once their HP was whittled down to a certain level. Amongst the plethora of jobs to have featured across the Final Fantasy franchise, Blue Mage perhaps stands out compared to the rest due to its unorthodox practice of adopting enemy skills to use in combat. The compendium of spells available to the Blue Mage depended on the setting of the game and the monsters that were present. In some games, these combinations have led to Blue Mages being very potent and useful, and in Final Fantasy XIV, Blue Mages even had the potential to one-shot boss entities thanks to one of the game's most powerful abilities, Final Sting. Final Sting is officially described as a desperate mage's last resort technique that converts all of a user's life force into an ethereal poison that is then injected into a single adversary. Blue mages could learn this ability by defeating a level 13 or above Killer Vesp, or a level 35 or above Temple Bee. As an attack, Final Sting was one of the most powerful abilities thanks to its potency of 2500 and its piercing capabilities. But there was of course one major drawback. After being used, the player became incapacitated. But even then, the damage output was just too good to the extent that it could make for an excellent means for blue mages to finish off some tough bosses. But this was with the ability in its default state, because it could be pushed even further. Using resources like the Moon Flute and Whistle, players could increase their potency of Final Sting by another 50 and 80% respectively. Additionally, applying debuffs like Condensed Libra to enemies could increase the damage dealing potential even further. And if other spells were used to bolster the damage output of Final Sting, it could give way to players achieving some astonishing numbers, with some even reporting that Final Sting has dealt over 2 million points of damage with a single use. Final Fantasy VIII's junction system served as one of the more unique combat systems in the entire franchise, as instead of the game featuring traditional equipment and accessories, character builds were determined by Guardian forces and junctioning spells to their respective stats. It meant this system allowed for some very significant customization, and with some careful manipulation, players could take serious advantage of the game's mechanics to execute some intriguing strategies. But one particular setup involving Rinoa and Meteor proved to be especially potent, to the point that it has since been dubbed Meteor Wing by fans. For this setup to work, players first needed to learn Rinoa's second limit break, Angel Wing. When used, this caused Rinoa to enter a sort of magic frenzy state, where she uncontrollably cast random spells from her inventory at 5 times the normal power. The second component was therefore Meteor, a non-elemental spell that could hit targets multiple times. Because of the damage-spreading nature of the spell, this then made it very strong against single targets, especially bosses. But together, Angel Wing and Meteor could achieve some substantially favourable results in combat. The idea was to have Rinoa possess Meteor as her only offensive spell in order to knock out any probability of her casting anything else. It was also recommended that her magic stat be as high as possible to maximise the individual damage of each hit of Meteor. Meeting these conditions meant Rinoa would continuously spam Meteor at opposing foes, with each hit landing damage in the thousands. And if the player used spells such as Meltdown to reduce the enemy's vitality and spirit to 0, each hit of Meteor Wing could potentially inflict between 5,000 and 9,999 points of damage. With high enough magic stats in addition to the 5 times power boost, this meant that Rinoa could deal almost 100,000 points of damage with a single cast of Meteor under the influence of Angel Wing. But the broader damage dealing potential was quite incredible. And if you'd like to find out more, we'd recommend checking out this guide from Fuzzfinger Gaming. While Final Fantasy VI introduced desperation attacks, the concept was solidified in Final Fantasy VII, where the term limit break was introduced. Some of these limit breaks have since become iconic, with Omnislash serving as the perfect example. But even though it has received by far the most attention, no doubt because of its inclusion during the final stages and its damage dealing capabilities, it was not alone in that regard. Angamax, for example, was the second, third level limit break available to Barret that could be acquired after using his satellite beam limit break 6 times. It landed a whopping 18 hits of physical damage against random targets, the most hits out of any ability in the game, with each strike dealing half the damage of Barret's normal attack. But because it hit 18 times, it was capable of being one of, if not the most powerful attacks in the game. To achieve Angamax's maximum potential, a few steps were necessary though. One was acquiring Missing Score, Barret's ultimate weapon, while another was equipping powerful master materia such as Knights of the Round. Using power sources to permanently increase Barret's strength also helped to deal more damage, as would using hero drinks. When combined, this would give each individual hit of Angamax the potential to deal 9,999 points of damage, and this meant it could achieve almost 2,000 points of damage in total, which was more than the maximum potential of Omnislash. As an extension of this, a glitch was also found that allowed any ability, even limit breaks, to be linked with Quadra Magic. This exploit led to the advent of Quadra Angamax, and even though the damage can't necessarily be legitimate due to the nature of it being facilitated by a glitch, it's still quite fascinating. For more information, check out this video by Phantasm. That then brings us on to Armiger Unleashed from Final Fantasy XV. In light of Final Fantasy XV's transition to active combat, Armiger effectively functioned as a limit break that complemented the battle system. Unlocked by obtaining royal arms via story progression, when using Armiger, Noctis entered an enhanced state where he could deal increased damage to foes for about 10 seconds, and this could be further extended to 15 seconds if upgraded on the Ascension grid. When Armiger was active, Noctis' speed and strength were increased, his movement was converted into warps, and his warp strikes were much stronger. It also prevented Noctis from entering a danger state if his health fell to 0, and he could also use the royal arms without losing any health. But while Armiger itself boasted considerable power, it was just a step beneath Armiger Unleashed, the ability's ascended form. Introduced in the Windows Edition and Royal Edition, Armiger Unleashed was far more than just a powerful evolution of the base Armiger. And this was because it not only had a longer duration, but it was also capable of breaking through the damage ceiling with individual hits. Almost all attack damage under Armiger Unleashed was based off of Noctis' strength stat, barring attacks from the Bow of the Clever, Scepter of the Pious, and Holy, as these were calculated using Noctis' magic stat. But Armiger Unleashed replaced ally techniques with its own unique selection. Royal Cleave, which dealt light damage, Apocalypsis, which dealt ballistic damage, Dynastic Stance, which dealt supplementary damage alongside Noctis' normal attacks, and Legacy of the Lucii, a light damaging combo that was perhaps the most powerful technique in the arsenal. Legacy of the Lucii itself was capable of dealing over 100,000 points of damage, and it's perhaps for this reason that the player was prohibited from using Armiger Unleashed against certain enemies, such as the Adamantoids. But with that, there were 7 more of the most powerful attacks from across the entire franchise as selected by you, the viewers. Be sure to let us know in the comments below which of these you've managed to utilize successfully, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube member supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent and Sukun TDK, your super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.